Now, Mr Gillespie-Jones.
Your Honour, Mr Cad, I appear for Mr Marijantis, who left Turana 2 years before you arrived.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sorry?
Could you repeat what you said, please?
I appear for Mr Joseph Marijancevic, who left Turana shortly before you arrived. So, I just have a few questions. You said that, in answer to Councillor Sisting's question, that there were staff there that shouldn't have been employed, in your opinion, when you first arrived. Would that be fair?
Yep.
And I think you made reference to staff saying, well, I was going to bring a certain trainee a birthday cake for all the wrong reasons. What did you think were the wrong reasons for that?
People, I think some people saw the kids there as prey. Others have, well, I want the power, whether they admit to that or not, you know, but I can direct people. I can make them do what I want to do. Other people wanted to help, but didn't know how. There's a lot of variety of people come seeking employment. Others saw it as a step in the public service.
Yes, I see. And with respect to the wrong reasons, would you, do you mean that would be an exercise of giving a reward as well as the exercise of power, that kind of thing?
I think there were quite a few of those that come through Turana that saw bullying as a way of life and the ability to stand over and be actually protected in your stand over.
Yes. I think you made reference to Mr Reynolds, who was in disgrace for some reason.
Mr.
Reynolds?
Mr Reynolds, when I went to Turana, I always thought there was only 4 chiefs, but there were 5. Mr Reynolds was referred to as the Phantom Chief. He'd evidently fallen out of favour, I don't know, before I got there, and the only thing he was looking after was a meeting office, which already had a senior in it to run it, and he seemed to spend his days, evidently, he'd disappear and they say, oh, he's down talking to the tradies or he's somewhere else. But he, from all accounts, Mr Reynolds blocked his copybook when he upset a appeals court judge by not producing the witness he had been directed to a thing and causing a case to be adjourned again. And Mr Reynolds was advised, I believe, to find other employment.
Well, you said also in answer to Councillor Sisting's question that I think as you perhaps advanced through the ranks, that a number of officers were got rid of. I think you remember saying that. You know?
Yep.
When would that have happened? Are you able to say?
Let's see. I started to notice a thinning of the ranks not long after I started, you know. Oh, where's the old chap that used to work there? Oh, he's retired or he's joined the Housing Commission. And you seem to see faces disappearing. There were a few faces that stayed that shouldn't have, right? But they were too powerful to be removed.
I see. So the ones that weren't sufficiently well entrenched, who might have been there for the wrong reasons, they left a time after you began. Is that the situation?
The thing was, shall we say, base graders who had no protection really when the heat's on, they left. The entrenched ones, we'll say some seniors and some chiefs, stayed because they could protect themselves. They could, circumvent any inquiries or anything. They had the power. Yes. Very interesting to note, you spoke about Mr. Horn today and his unusual thing. Other long-standing chief there was Arthur Hannaford. Arthur Hannaford was dismissed by the department and brought before the court for theft of many thousands of dollars of Turana's property, and I believe they took his superannuation off him as well as part of it.
Time that Mr. Green came around the facility and inspected the nativity scenes.
Correct.
Was it your experience that, aside from that, the superintendent, Mr. Green, would come around and have much to do with you?
I don't think I saw I might have seen him once after that nativity scene, and I never saw him again until today.
At that time, you were at the coalface, as it were.
That's right.
And the superintendent, would he have much to do with those at the coalface?
Virtually none. He relied on the principal was a man of some integrity, but he relied mainly on the chiefs, Horn, Hannaford, Wilkie, Trimmer. I don't think Mr. Reynolds attended any of the chief superintendent meetings.
During the time that you continued to work there after Mr. Green, there were other superintendents who you worked under, yes?
Correct. Many.
And did those superintendents adopt a similar approach to contact with those workers at the coalface?
There were very few superintendents that made themselves available, not only to staff but to trainees, but there were some that would wander around the units at odd times and talk to boys, right? But I think it was more in the lines of what's your footy team and how are they going sort of thing. There was no personal interaction, no.
You were asked some questions about the process by which you could have made complaints up a hierarchical structure.
I woke up.
I'm sorry, who would you have made a complaint to in the first instance? What was the name of the position?
Well, I was a youth officer. I would have had to make my complaint via the senior, who would take it to the chief, who would take it to the principal, who would take it to the deputy superintendent maybe, who would take it to the superintendent. And you can be darn sure if it was a negative sort of comment I was making or complaint, it didn't get past the chief.
You were asked some questions about the manuals. Do you remember receiving any training about how to interpret the manual or how to apply it?
No, I think they thought we could all read and write.
And that assumption, or that responsibility for interpreting it, that just fell on your shoulders independently
Yes.
of one another?
You would have the chief march in and throw a bunch of papers on the desk and say, that's the manual, you read it and sign it.
And when you signed it, what did you understand you were doing that
On the
for?
back of the Turana manual that we had, there was a blank page with your name written in block letters, and you had to sign your name and put the date stating that it said up the top about I state I've read the manual and understood.
All right. Finally, You've indicated to me outside of the courtroom today that it's often the case that it's heard that people didn't know then what they know now. It's the case, isn't it, that at the time that you worked there, your job was principally to look after children?
My job was to look after children the same as my parents looked after me. And to be quite honest, the statement "we don't know now," didn't know then, we know now, that's a load of garbage, because I was raised in the hard times, and it's the fact that parents cared. They looked and cared for their children. They assisted and guided them. And that was the role that the youth officer should have stepped in. That was the role the department never filled. That was the role that the department was well aware of, but made no attempt whatsoever to provide care and nurturing to young people that weren't getting at home, that were living on the street, that were in deplorable conditions. They may have been offenders, but they're human beings starting on the journey of life. I'm near the end of mine, but so help me God, I hope somebody puts the proverbial rocket under the department and make them take responsibility for what they've undertaken and sworn to do, but never carried out.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Nothing further.
Nothing arising, thank you.
Just one matter that Commissioner Murray wants to raise with you, Mr. Cadd, before I excuse you.
Mr. Cadd, were you ever the officer on duty when the police returned a absconded child to you or to the institution?
Yes, I worked in the emitting office, and it wasn't unusual to get an absconder in, right?
Did the police ever report to you that children had said to them that they were running away because they were being hurt?
No, never. Police, 9 times out of 10, it would be transit police that would bring them in as from a station. They would pick them up, bring them in. They mightn't have had any contact with the child. But even if it was the arresting officers, all they were interested in was putting them in, getting a receipt and getting back in their car and going. There was very little interaction between police and admitting staff.
So the police never made a report to you?
No, never. They might make a think, we're bringing Fred back for the 9th time, can't you keep him locked up?
Did the children ever report to you or to your knowledge to any other officer that the police had mistreated them?
Yes, you'd get some, they were pretty rough on me, Mr. Cadd. They pushed me around and they put the cuffs on me and threatened me. And you couldn't go anywhere with that because that's only the child telling you, and nobody was interested.
What did you do with the reports to you of mistreatment by the police?
You would write a brief note to your senior, knowing full well that it was going to go in the waste paper bin.
Thank you.
Anything arising from that for anyone? Mr. Cadd, thank you for your attendance at the Royal Commission, and you're now excused.
Your Honour, before the next witness is called, and the next witness is Mr David Green, Can I just note for the benefit of the bar table the time constraints today? I have made some effort to limit the questions I have to Mr Green so that I'm not obviously covering matters that he has set out in his statement, knowing that the Royal Commission has that evidence. There are some matters that I need to do so in brief, but can I ask my learned friends to bear in mind the time constraints that we do have and not to cover material that I have or material that's obviously in the statement so that we can get through all the survivor witnesses today?
Yes, and indeed it goes without saying, Mr Wire, that those matters that are contained in the statement once tendered, of course, become evidence before the Commission, and they don't need to be repeated by questions from the bar table.
May it please the Commission. Your Honour, I call Mr David Green.
Mr Green, do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation.
Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Mr Green. Just take a seat right where you are, please.
Mr Green, could you please tell the Royal Commission your full name?
My full name is Alan David Green.
You've provided a statement to the Royal Commission which is dated the 11th of August 2015.
Correct.
And is the information in that statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
I tender that statement, Your Honour.
30.13.
Sir, you're now retired, is that correct?
I am.
You set out in your statement that from 1965 until 1966 you were employed at Turana as Assistant Superintendent, correct?
Late 65, Council, to the end of 1966. Correct.
And then you were later employed from 1966 to 1970 as Superintendent, is that right?
No. At the end of 1966, I was transferred to another training centre called Langi Kalkal. And I returned from there in April 1968, and I was superintendent at Turana from April 68 to mid 1970.
Right. So apart from you, so you had two stints at Turana, is that right? One as Assistant Superintendent for about a year, and another one as Superintendent for, say, a year and a half.
Correct.
Did you have any further dealings with Turana or any employment directly with Turana?
I had no further direct employment with Turana.
But you went on to work for the department, is that correct?
Correct.
And what were your responsibilities at the department immediately after you left Turana?
Immediately after I left Turana, I was appointed to a position called the Supervisor of Classification and Treatment, which was those run by non-government organisations, all the youth hostels, and the decision-making processes with respect to classification and review for the boys and girls who were living in those, and young men and young women who were living in those facilities.
How long did you hold that position for?
Soon after I was appointed to that position, I was involved in a departmental process called regionalisation, and Council, I'm afraid I cannot remember. I sort of transitioned from that position into being a director and Councillor, I'm afraid I cannot remember. I transitioned from that position into being a director responsible for the department's regional or local services. So I moved during, I think, the year, within a year of my going into head office, I moved into that role.
So after leaving Turana, you had a...
I moved during, I think, the year, within a year of my going into head office, I moved into that role.
So after leaving Turana, you had a senior role within the department for many years, is that correct?
That is correct.
In order to become the assistant superintendent at Turana, did you have any specific qualifications relating to childcare or supervision?
Not specific qualifications relating to childcare.
You had an arts degree, is that right?
Correct.
And when you graduated, you spent a couple of years as a youth parole officer before you moved to Chicago to undertake postgraduate study.
That's correct.
What was your postgraduate?
Work with youth in particular, and I had some part-time work in Chicago, working with young people. What was called, don't misunderstand the expression, street work. And I worked as a part-time relieving manager at a youth hostel, a multiracial youth hostel in downtown Chicago.
So you were recruited while you were overseas by Ian Cox, the then superintendent of Turana. How did you know him? Recruited while you were overseas by Ian Cox, the then superintendent of Turana. How did you know him?
Of Tally Ho in the late 1950s. I think I knew him as the superintendent of Tally Ho.
When you got back to Australia and undertook that role as assistant superintendent, you met him in your professional capacity in Australia?
Yes.
When you got back to Australia and undertook that role as assistant superintendent, you tagged Mr. Cox for a while to learn the role. Looking after the boys involved a fair amount of authoritarian control and command.
Yes.
You knew that the superintendent was responsible for overseeing the whole of Turana, is that right?
I did.
And you understood that Turana housed a number of boys who had come from very troubled backgrounds.
Yes.
And Turana held boys of varying ages some of whom were admitted on care and protection, some of whom were committed for criminal, and Turana held boys of varying ages some of whom were admitted on care and protection, some of whom were committed for criminal offences, some of whom were on remand for a court appearance, for a protection application or criminal charges, and wards or trainees that had been transferred from children's home or youth training centres.
That is correct. I understood it as there being, I think, 8 different, what we might call legal categories, defining the basis of boys and young men's admission to Turana.
And there was an effort made to keep boys separate, that is, those who were admitted on care and protection separate from those who were in for criminal offences?
There was an effort.
But in fact, there was a lot of mixing of the categories.
The effort was not successful.
Why was that?
The combination of 3 factors. One was that we operated with 12 different sections, and when security was needed for a boy or a young man, we only had a limited number of options, and therefore, on some occasions, boys or young men who were committed to the care of the department had to be placed in a secure section with boys or young men who'd been sentenced. There was age distinctions. We kept boys 14 to 17 years of age, separate from boys 17 to 21. And then, so there was another factor which determined the separation, and then sometimes forced us to care for sentenced boys and boys who were wards together. And the third factor was overcrowding, so that the appropriate section for, say, a ward admitted from the court or admitted because of a breakdown in another placement, the appropriate section was full or over full, and so we had to put that boy somewhere else.
So did overcrowding cause a problem in general during your year and a half at Turana? Apart from that classification issue and the mixing of boys, did it cause other difficulties?
There were other difficulties. In terms of the appropriate numbers, we weren't overcrowded every day of the year, but we were overcrowded in some places most of the year, and across the whole institution we were overcrowded many times during the year.
And that made it difficult, didn't it, to engage boys in appropriate education and training programs?
Yes. One of the significant failings of the institution was that the provision of meaningful education, training and work opportunities, places was limited. So we had a significant number, it varied from time to time, a significant number of boys and young men who should have been at school or doing some kind of real work or training, such as trade training, who were essentially unoccupied, and the officers had to make up some kind of program for them, which was difficult for the officers concerned, especially when they were in secure sections.
You sat through the evidence of Mr. Cadd, is that right?
I'm sorry, Councillor.
You've been in court all morning this morning to
Yes.
hear the other witness who gave evidence this morning. He told the Royal Commission that some of the officers were very ill-suited to the job. Did you ever...
That some of the officers were more naturally skilled or had some training or more capable of undertaking those activities, were more naturally skilled or had some training or more capable of undertaking those activities than others.
There was no specific training for youth officers focused on the welfare of boys, was there?
In 1961, there was a new act, as paper to the Commission, your paper to the Commission, and that training division, as discussed this morning, initially was at Lisson Grove in Hawthorne Division for the first time, and that training division, as discussed this morning, initially was at Lisson Grove in Hawthorne, and then it went to Loyola, and courses were introduced for childcare officers, youth officers and prison officers. Lectured to them or participated in discussions at them. I did not do those courses, no. Any of those courses.
So let me come back to...
Participated in discussions at them. I did not do those courses, no. Any of those courses.
So let me come back to the role of the superintendent. What you explain in your statement is that Turana was a very hierarchical structure of staffing. You agree?
Yes.
You say the most senior position was that of superintendent. Superintendent was at times supported by an assistant, and below the superintendent were various levels. The people that had direct contact with the children were the youth officer. Did not want to continue to report that up the chain, or indeed a youth officer. then the superintendent may not find out about significant problems going on at Turana. Do you agree that that might have happened?
The superintendent depended upon that chain of command and depended on the critical link between the superintendent and the sections that chain of command and depended on the critical link were the chief youth officers.
You tried to, you say in your statement, interact with the boys yourself during your year and a half at the Turana, is that right?
I did.
You tried to, you say in your statement, interact with the boys yourself during your year and a half at the Turana, is that right?
I did.
Did overcrowding make that difficult?
It didn't prevent it. It made it difficult in the sense that there were, at any point of time, my memory is at any point in time there were from 280 to 310, 320 residents in all of those different categories. I had a commitment to trying is that as a reception, remand, classification and centre of life, I wouldn't do that, but the other factor which is critical here is that my memory is that there would be between 25 and 50 new admissions across all those legal categories. A lot of those admissions were remand admissions. And across all those legal categories, a lot of those admissions were remand admissions. And sometimes a boy would only be in overnight on remand or until bail or till...
Okay, so that made it difficult for you to develop a direct relationship with the boys?
And I'm sorry, I wasn't...
No, not at all. That's why you had to rely on the youth officers?
Correct.
Did any child ever come to you when you were doing your round?
I had a few occasions in which boys spoke to me about being physically assaulted by other boys.
What did you do in those circumstances?
I would report that. I would discuss it with the boy. I'd report that to the senior or the chief and ask that the matter be investigated and that with the boy. I'd report that to the senior or the chief and ask that the matter be investigated and that action be taken.
The chief or the youth officer was, wouldn't it? For example, if somebody was a particularly empathetic worker, then the needs of the child might be met. But if somebody was harsh or less empathetic, they might be ignored in those circumstances.
Yes, but as superintendent, my expectation of what would happen would not have been based on the personality of the person involved. I would have expected that the boy, young man, would have been respectfully listened to, that there would be an incident report made out and that some decisions would be made with respect to the event. It could be that the event would be dismissed or recorded as being not of substance or insignificant, but I would still expect that to happen, irrespective of the character or the...
I understand that, but you don't disagree with what I just put to you, do you? That it depends heavily in those circumstances on the empathy and personality of the youth officer?
No, I don't disagree with the statement you made.
You note in your statement that there were over 80 youth officers that reported to the senior youth officers.
That's an estimate. I do not have a clear recall of the exact number of...
You will have heard evidence that some of those officers were recruited from the army, for example. Do you remember that?
I heard that. The staff, when I came to work at Turana, in 66 and in 68, there was, in my experience, there was a little turnover of staff, and many of the officers had been there for quite some time. And so was not aware of their from whence they were recruited, from many of the officers. I was when they were recruited while I was, because I'd welcome a new staff member, but I don't have a clear knowledge. I didn't have the knowledge necessarily of all the background of all the officers.
When you were superintendent, do you have responsibility for recruiting new members?
No.
Who had responsibility for that?
The principal youth officer and the chief youth officers were critical in the recruitment of this time.
When you were superintendent, you lived off the grounds of Turana, down the road in a house provided by the department, is that right?
That's correct. You
relied at night time on supervision being conducted by the youth officers or senior youth officers?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. You would have heard the last witness give evidence that, in his view, night supervision was hopeless, horrific. He said that observations were limited to looking through a slot in the door in the dark. Did you ever hear about that while you were superintendent? So that is, did you ever hear about problems with proper supervision at night when you were superintendent?
Yes, and I was regularly called about problems at night, and at least 1 or 2 or 3 times a week I would, independently of being called, I would circulate around the institution at night, either on my way home from work at the end of the working day or by coming back.
Did your officers ever say to you, look, there's a problem with us supervising at night, we can't get around and keep an eye on all the boys?
Yes. There were 12 sections, Council, and there was one officer in each of the lock sections. There was one officer to cover 4 open sections, and there was a night senior. I think we had 10 or 11 officers on duty at night. And the situation was known by me and was known to be precarious.
And known by the department also, Mr Green?
Your Honour, the issue of the staffing of Turana and its capacity to manage the demand during the 1960s, where the numbers were increasing and so on, was constantly discussed.
With whom?
With the Deputy Director of the division, the Youth Welfare Division, with the Director of the division who oversaw all the youth services.
So these are government officials inside the department with the responsibility for running that institution?
Yes.
And you were making those reports?
Yes, and others were as well. Other superintendents were reporting on pressures in their institutions.
And what was the response?
The budget processes of the department was the response, because altering our staffing, increasing our staffing was a budget issue, and there were budget processes, and submissions were made, and priorities were given, and that was the decision for the division, the department itself, and then it went to Treasury, and then eventually the government would make decisions about priorities. may I say, from the mid-1960s on, there was a view in the department that increasing the staffing and the capacity of Turana in particular was not the answer. What we had to do was stop boys coming in, not increase the facility of the institute. Priority was given to the development of alternatives to the institution, and because with respect to Turana, the buildings, the design of the buildings, such things as the dormitories, which has been accurately described earlier, we just needed to stop and try and divert, as it was called, boys and young men coming into the facility. And that was so that had an implication for the financing of the institution.
In your reports to the department, Mr. Green, were you making clear, for example, that the overcrowding problem you've confirmed in evidence, that the ramifications of the overcrowding problem were that it was not possible to keep boys safe?
Your Honour, yes, I did. In the process of preparing myself for this Royal Commission, I have to say I personally feel I may not have been as urgent or strident enough about that. I have to say that when we're working in the facilities, it's not that people said to me, look, this is the reality, you just have to work with it and live with it. But in a sense, that was the kind of way we reacted. We have to wait on the budget, wait on the allocation priorities, wait on the budget process. My primary responsibility was, as directed, was to manage the running of the institution, the safety and protection of the boys in the institution, and the safety of the staff within the resources that were allocated on an annual basis. This was an acute problem. I'll just give one very brief example. If at night a medical emergency arose and a boy had to go to hospital, this didn't happen a lot, but it did happen. We had 10 or 12 officers on duty. The escort for that boy would have to be drawn from the staff on duty at that night. That meant that the senior, what's called the night senior, who circulated around units, would have to fill the gap left by withdrawing an officer to do the hospital escort, for example. Now, we found this extremely difficult, and sometimes be called about that kind of situation, and sometimes we would try and find someone we could bring in, but that meant overtime and that meant costs, and as superintendent, every superintendent had to balance that decision making.
Mr Green, I want to come now to disclosure of child sexual abuse at Turana. What you say in your statement is that at this time, meaning when you were superintendent at Turana, we didn't use the term child sexual abuse. There was clear recognition of the significance of what were called problematic sexual behaviours and sexual assault, and clear recognition that an inmate could be subject to sexual assault or could perpetrate sexual assault. Did you recognise at that time the risk that inmates could be sexually assaulted either by each other or by officers?
I recognise both those realities, but during my time at Turana, I did not have a report with respect to sexual abuse by an officer.
You will have heard the last witness say that around that time the department was thought to be a civilised place, that people didn't really focus on the risk of sexual abuse. Do you agree with that? I'm paraphrasing.
Yes, I wouldn't have put it in those terms, but I would have put it this way. The Turana was a facility for a significant number of boys and young men who had experienced themselves traumas, sometimes violent fathers, violent experiences, or themselves had been involved in issues around violence, including sexual violence. But the majority of our younger boys came to us having experienced significant problems within their families, and we live with the reality of recognising those experiences and trying to manage their behaviours and relationships within that context.
Sorry.
I'd like to agree that it was, as it were, a civilised place, but we operated within realities. And on a hot, humid night in a secure section with boys or young men overcrowded, in other words, sleeping in confined quarters. The tensions and problems which would arise from that were complex and real, and that could not be denied.
And they were evident to you at the time?
Yes.
And a lot of those, the majority of those boys were adolescents who you would have been aware were hormonal and just coming into puberty or having reached puberty recently.
Yes.
And that creates its own powder keg of emotions for those boys, agreed?
Yes.
So you just were very frankly acknowledged to the Royal Commission the concerns you had about the lack of supervision at night. Did that include concerns that there might be inappropriate sexualised behaviours with those boys?
Yes.
And to the extent that you were aware of the risks of inappropriate sexual behaviour, did that focus on the child-to-child behaviour rather than any focus on the possibility they might be molested by a staff member?
Council, I was focused on the child-to-child behaviour of boys and young men being locked together in different types of night sleeping arrangements. I was focused on that. I tried to take some measures with respect to dealing with those situations, but some of them were impossible to deal with because I had no other option. The institution had no other option but that they would be, say, 12, 15 boys in a dormitory. The dormitories were a huge problem in terms of the safety of boys.
But is it true that there was not any heightened, I withdraw that, no particular measures were put in place to safeguard the children from being sexually abused by the person who was in charge of nighttime supervision, the youth officer?
As superintendent, I took no measures. I depended upon the trust and had to trust the integrity of the officers who were on duty at the time.
Mr Green, I'm not going to refer to it in detail because we've already discussed the Turana manual. You note in your statement it was not comprehensive. It lacked guidelines for proactive problem solving, particularly in the area of sexual abuse. Correct?
Correct.
And you say it required youth workers to make a written report to the senior youth officer on specified incidents. And as the Commission's already heard, that included unnatural acts committed or reported to have been committed by trainees on other trainees, peculiar behaviour of particular trainees, and any incident which is of an unusual nature. Did you understand that the reference there to be unnatural act? I withdraw that. Did you understand the reference to unnatural acts to be a reference to sexual acts?
I do not understand the basis of the term unnatural act. As superintendent, I understood that some behaviours were assaultive, intimidatory, and criminal in the sense that they were defined in the Crimes Act, or they were specified in the Crimes Act. I understood bullying, intimidation, harassment and assaultative behaviour. I understood that. I didn't understand or operate with some concept of an unnatural act.
In any event, you say that during your time at Turana, you do not recall being informed of or having any knowledge of any incidents of child sexual abuse of a ward or trainee by a staff member. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you have any recollection of being informed of any report of sexual abuse of a trainee by another trainee?
I have recollection of that.
And how do you say that would have been escalated? How do you say that would have been dealt with?
There was two ways it came to me. One would be through the process of a night report, of an incident report in the section duty book, the senior or chief coming on duty in the morning and contacting me and saying there was an incident reported with respect to what called sexual abuse. That was one way it came to me. The second way was that on a few occasions in my movement around the institution, and I'd be talking with a ward or a trainee, they would say, in effect, that they were being abused by some other ward or trainee, almost inevitably unnamed, and they would not have used the term abused. They would have used a variety of other terms.
Do you ever recall arranging any welfare checks for those boys who reported sexual abuse or reported sexualised behaviour, even if they didn't use the term sexual abuse?
Welfare checks?
Yes. Was there any effort then to ensure the safety or emotional security of those boys in response?
Oh, in some occasions, well, I would expect the procedure would be that they would be referred, the medical officer would be contacted, or the nurse.
Who would do that?
The section.
Do you have any recollection of that ever happening?
Yes, well, I have recollection, Councillor. I haven't distinct memory. Superintendent, I'll act on the presumption that if there had been any serious incident or indication of injury, that would have happened, that there would have been contact with the medical office. Then I would expect that the section, generally the senior and the chief, would make what arrangements they could to look after the welfare of that boy.
Did you sit through the evidence of the 4 survivors who've spoken about their time at Turana?
Most of that.
You will have heard that for the survivors who reported any form of abuse to the youth officers, nothing was done, or the officers who they reported to, nothing was done to escalate that in terms of getting them welfare or in some circumstances to protect them from the abuse. Does that surprise you?
It horrifies me. And it is extremely disturbing.
Does it surprise you, given the authoritarian model that was in operation at Turana?
The witnesses, I think, answered the question. It's been asked to speculate on something that happened 50 years ago, and I'm not sure how that answer is going to add to the evidence that's already been given.
No, I press it, Your Honour. The question was, does it surprise you? And the answer given, which I'm not suggesting was entirely unresponsive, but was, it horrifies me, which is one answer. And the next question is, does it surprise you?
Yes, I'll allow the question. Yeah. And the answer was yes. Did you say, Mr Green?
I did.
It does surprise you.
So one thing that you say in your statement at paragraph 53 is that it's your memory in dealing with reports at this time that boys rarely provided all the details of physical or sexual assaults, but particularly sexual assaults, for fear of being labelled a dobber or a lagger, or for fear of being further victimised, intimidated and targeted by other boys. Correct?
Correct.
And that's one reason, isn't it, why some of the children may not have reported the abuse at all?
Correct. I think the failure to report or to report what the assault actually was, or the event actually was closely related to the problem that the boy, young man, would confront in his own mind. I will say this is not speculation, that by speaking it, the consequences could be worse than keeping it to himself. And I have said that in my witness statement, and I have memories of having a really strong sense that a boy was not telling me what actually happened because he did not think that I could protect him if he had. But I had that sense before on the job. My recollection is I had that sense on the job before I started preparing for this commission. I'm trying to say it's not...
Meaning you had that understanding in 1968?
I had that understanding in 1968.
And what did you do about that, Mr Green?
My recollection, Your Honour, is that on occasions I would attempt to get the boy to talk about what had happened, and in the case that he didn't, even in the case that he didn't, I would say to the chief or the senior, I think XX is troubled, might be under pressure, might be being intimidated. Can you keep an eye on this? Can you make a note of it?
So what you're describing is an informal response from you.
Yes.
No complaint handling procedure, no instruction in how to systematically deal with the issues.
Correct. If the boy had not lodged a complaint, I didn't institute a complaint process. Do I understand the question you're posing to me correctly?
I understand what you're describing to us is an ad hoc response of yours to your awareness as at 1968 that it was difficult, if not impossible, for a boy to safely make a complaint about the risk to himself of sexual abuse or physical abuse.
Yes, I would like to be very clear about this. I have recollections of talking with boys, and I would have the sense that they had been intimidated or abused or assaulted, and they were reluctant or not going to tell me. And Your Honour, my response in those situations was that I would not, in a sense, force them to reveal it, if I could have forced them to reveal it. So my response would be, as it were, to register an alert with respect to them. Your Honour, you said ad hoc. I would register. I can recall saying, I'm concerned about so-and-so, without specifying what I thought was happening. I hope that's made myself clear.
Perhaps we'll take the lunch adjournment at this stage, Mr. Ryan. We'll return it to Mr. Green. Thank you.